We started with that initial reminder that about evangelism. We spoke a lot about evangelism, and there are really only 10 key points that we covered in the last 3 months when we started Gospel Culture. So if you remember, we agreed that evangelism is the supreme priority of the church. If you remember, we were not talking about the purpose. The purpose of the church is to love God. The purpose of our lives is to worship him, to love him. However, priority is a different word. And our priority is to really prioritize the commands that the Lord has given us that are time sensitive. It's very interesting, but many Christians, they struggle with the understanding about evangelism. They always talk to me about, what about discipleship, Tony? People always say to me, but, should we not be discipling people? But consider a burning house. You need to first rescue the survivors of a burning house before you teach them fire safety. It's obvious. And in a similar way, we need to lead the lost to Christ before we teach them how to live as Christians. And I think that's quite an important reality. When we were looking at the teaching on how to reach Muslims, we spoke about how Muslims have a book that is their ultimate authority. We have a person, that's Jesus. And of course, if you see somebody drowning in the water, what are you going to do? Go to the bookshop and find a book about how to swim and you throw them the book? No. Actually, we have a person who goes into that water and rescues the person that's drowning. So going back to evangelism, it's so important to understand that evangelism is a priority. That's step number 1 in the discipleship process. We also were able to reinforce our understanding of this biblical definition, not just because it's personal opinion. We can all read the Bible and interpret a Bible verse in different ways. However, according to leading Bible scholars like Dr. John Stott and Dr. J.I. Packer, if you remember, we spoke about the Lausanne Conference in 1974, attended by hundreds of the world's leading Bible scholars. And if you remember, we also mentioned other conferences like the Legionnaire Ministries This We Believe 2000 conference, attended by 229 of the world's leading Bible scholars. And they all agree that evangelism is the proclamation of the gospel. So that's actually what the word means, because it's translated from the original Greek word euangelion. It's a sad reality that in the church today, if you ask people what does evangelism mean, they scratch their head and they tell you what they feel it means. But we can't do that with biblical words. With biblical words, we need to have biblical accuracy. And so that is an accurate definition. Evangelism is the proclamation of the gospel. Also, we looked at other elements of this word, of the root word evangelism. Evangelist, that is the person with the gift of evangelism. And if you remember, we spoke about how this person will be sharing the gospel and also teaching other people how to share the gospel. We also looked at the word evangel, and that is the gospel message that we are to share itself. And of course, evangelism is not just for evangelists. You could be an evangelizer. Maybe God's called you with a different calling in your life. Maybe a gift of administration, a gift of love, a gift of worship, a gift of prayer, and so on. But that does not mean you cannot be an evangelizer, because an evangelizer is anybody who spreads or proclaims the gospel. Are you with me, friends? Also, we looked at 3 wrong definitions. We spoke earlier about Satan, how Satan wants to try to take us away from the Great Commission all the time. He does not want the world evangelized. And so he tries to stop us by putting wrong definitions. And if I can remind you, we looked at the first wrong definition, where Satan wants us to believe that evangelism is winning souls. It's very clever and very cunning. That's how the devil works. You see, he's not going to come up to you and say, hey, Christians, stop evangelizing. I don't like it. Because we wouldn't listen to him. No. He's going to take biblical definitions and twist them. And you see, winning souls sounds amazing. But winning souls is not evangelism. It is an end result of evangelism. And we looked at 5 reasons why calling evangelism winning souls will stop us sharing the gospel. If you remember, failure, bullying, watering down the message, we end up with fruitless results. And also we end up ruling out good methods of evangelism just because we couldn't see a soul won. So we begin to change everything, you see. Whereas God wants us to be faithful, to preach an unpopular message in a sinful world. So that was the first wrong definition. If I can remind you, the second wrong definition is where any activity that brings a non-Christian closer to conversion is evangelism. And again, if you remember, that's a wrong definition, because we looked at at each of the 5-fold ministry gifts in the 6-step model. If you remember the process of leading somebody to Jesus, step number 1 would be to plough the ground. You soften the hearts. You are preparing the ground to receive the seed. Step number 2 is sowing the seed. Step 3 is you provide conditions favourable for the seeds to grow. That would be watering. And then, of course, the next step is growing. And then harvesting. And then, of course, once you've got your harvest, then you thresh it. So, again, if you remember, evangelism is only step 2, where we sow the seed of the gospel. All of these steps are mission, but not all mission is evangelism. Evangelism is a key task within that mission. Also, if I can remind you of the 3rd wrong definition, where the devil would like us to believe that evangelism is a process. And again, that's very, very cunning for him to use that method, because remember the illustration of planting the seed in the ground. You don't take a seed and put it a little bit into the ground as part of the process and go away, and then come back and then push the seed in a bit more and go away and come back and is part of a process, finally sow the seed. No, you either sow the seed or you don't. And you see, evangelism is the proclamation of the gospel. It is a specific activity, it's a specific event that happens or doesn't happen. You may not always successfully include the gospel in your conversations, and that's okay. Of course, I hope that you would try to in the future, but you are only evangelizing when you are speaking or spreading the gospel. And understanding these wrong definitions is very useful, because you begin to understand the tricks that the devil uses. Also, if you remember, we looked at the gospel message, and we looked at the difference between the words, the works, and the effects of the gospel. If you remember, there's quite a difference. Remember the illustration of praying for a sick person. If I'm going to pray for a sick person, then that would be an amazing work of the gospel. I'm able to pray because the gospel's changed my life. It's a work of the gospel. Now, if the person that I'm praying for is healed, then we are seeing an effect of the gospel. And that's the power of God. It's wonderful. So the person has experienced the works. They've experienced the effects of being healed, but they've not heard the words of the gospel. So if you remember, the words are a carefully crafted salvation message that we are to speak. And if you remember, in the teaching over the last 3 months, we understood that wherever gospel is mentioned in the New Testament, the translation does not refer to works or effects. It's referring to words. And words are very important. Remember, how was the earth created? God spoke. He didn't do works. He didn't do effects. He spoke. And the world came into creation. So remember the words of the gospel, if you and I speak these words or type these words or give these words, you are working in the power of God. And so the power of the gospel, I hope you're going to take that with you into 2021. Also, if you remember, we looked at different gospel presentations. There are many ways of sharing the gospel. And if you remember, I showed you my favorite version, which is the long one, where I have a PowerPoint slide, the gospel message. We've got the wordless gospel using colors. We got the 𝐒𝐈𝐆𝐍 cube, 4-point gospel, 3 circles, the paper tear. I hope you have all had the opportunity to practice that a bit more. Maybe the tea bag presentation of the gospel. And of course, we've also got versions like the Good Artist for children. If you remember, there are 3 forms of persuasion that we looked at as well. There are the ways that we can actually communicate. And we remembered Aristotle, how he spoke about ethos, pathos, and logos. And again, these are also useful tools that we can use to communicate the gospel with people. Ethos, using our lives, our ethics, our credibility, the way we live our life. We need to be living the message. And so people may look at our life and ask the questions and be attracted to that mirror of Christ that we're trying to live. Pathos would be the emotions and the feelings that we have, that we are living. And it's with this that we can be able to reason with people and persuade them. And of course, most important as well would be logos. Logos would be the Greek word for word. That's also translated as logic and reason. And of course, we need to be prepared to give an explanation for our faith. If you can remember, if you were there that week, we looked at the 7 methods that we suggested to share the gospel. Remember, using gospel tracts. Maybe you are fearful to speak the message in 2021. Maybe it's a difficulty because, we can't go out because of social distancing. Maybe we can't, touch people or reach to people. Okay, so step number 1, you can discreetly leave gospel tracts. We still need to go to the shops to buy food. We need to go to the chemist to buy medicine. We need to go on walks for exercise. We can leave gospel tracts wherever we go. But of course, we also looked at another step where we are publicly leaving gospel tracts. That's where people see you doing it. The third step is where we give gospel tracts. And even in a COVID-19 world, well, if you order a takeaway at your home, somebody will give you the food or leave it on your step, and you can maybe give them a gospel tract. So there are many, many ways of distributing tracts. We can use survey approaches, advanced surveys we spoke about, maybe sharing the gospel one-to-one with strangers, and maybe sharing the gospel with groups. And again, as we go into 2021, we're going to be able to train and practice these methods more and more to make sure that we get really, really good at it. We also looked at the consequences of not proclaiming the gospel. If you remember, the increase and the rise and spread of false gospels. And then after this, we then began to look at some of the cross-cultural evangelism. If you remember, we were looking at common Muslim objections. And we had the opportunity to look at, why do Muslims find it very hard to accept the Christian gospel? Well, number one, if you remember, they do not believe that the Bible is God's revelation. For them, their only revelation is the Quran. And we began to look at some apologetics that relate to this issue. They also struggle with the fact that they do not believe that the Bible is the Word of God. And so again, we looked at some evidences that we might be able to use. Also, their objection is that Jesus is no more than a prophet. And again, we looked at that example. The fourth element was how Jesus is not the Son of God. Another Muslim objection is how Jesus cannot be God. And finally, their argument that for some Muslims, Jesus was never crucified. And if you remember, we looked at some Quranic evidence that actually contradicts some of these objections that they have anyway. We also then stepped into understanding about Satan. We tried to look at what motivates the enemy to stop evangelism. And if you remember, there are four points. The first one was ambition and glory. Satan is wanting to be the most important person in the universe. He's trying to replace Jehovah Jireh. Secondly, Satan's motive is territorial advantage. We were born in his kingdom, and he does not want us to be taken from his kingdom into the kingdom of light. And so the devil's motivated to stop the light of Jesus coming into our lives. This year in 2021, Satan will try to stop you shining the light of the gospel into the world that you live in, into your community, into your families. And now you know one of the devil's motives is territorial advantage. So it's something for you to keep in your mind as often as possible so that you understand the devil's tactics. Also, the third one was life preservation. The devil knows that when the Lord returns, then the devil will be punished. He's going to be thrown into a lake of burning sulfur. And so he has every reason to stop you and me sharing the gospel in 2021 because he's trying to put off his punishment. And finally, if you remember, the devil is trying to rob Christians of life. He's trying to rob Christians of life. He's come to steal and destroy. And finally, we also looked, if you remember, at the end of last year, we looked at some of the solutions to defeat the devil. And I think this is very important that we take this into the new year, because even some of these sessions that I've reminded many of you, I would not be surprised if some of these items we're forgetting them. And I think it's very healthy to keep on reminding yourself. It's like an athlete. It's not necessarily a boring thing to repeat the basic exercises. If anything, if you continue doing the basic exercises, then you'll be able to do the advanced exercises. And I guess with this teaching, it's important to continue reminding ourselves the basics. What is evangelism? It is the proclamation of the gospel. We need to keep on teaching this to other people. And if you remember, we looked at a 6-step plan for leaders. And if I can remind you of those 6 steps, and then we'll conclude. The first step the first solution to defeating the devil with his tricks and his devices is make a new wineskin. The language of using a wineskin, indeed, that was culturally relevant at the time, where they did not have plastic bottles or glass bottles. They would take a stomach of an animal and they would make a wineskin from that leather. And that would be the way to keep the wine inside clean and pure. And you see, unfortunately, with the wrong understandings we have of evangelism, it's important that we make a new wineskin. We need to share the teaching that we've been looking at and keep on reminding ourselves. I would like to see all of you equipped and qualified to teach this material yourself. I want to invite you, please contact me if you want the teaching slides. We will give that to you, and then hopefully you can teach this material. I really believe you would do an amazing job. So step number 1, make a new wineskin. Step 2, you got a new wineskin, put fresh wine into it. And of course, when we're talking about wine, it's a figurative description of what we're really talking about. And what we're talking about is that now you've got a clean, fresh, a new mindset of evangelism. Now we know how it should be done. Well, you'll put new wine in there by making ongoing annual evangelism training a priority. We need to now keep on training with each other. It would be lovely that all of us can learn how to share the gospel message. confidently. A third step is to stay focused. You can stay focused by continually looking at the target, by continually looking at evangelism, by continually looking at the gospel, and keep on reminding yourself. I wonder if any of you have tools of the gospel around your house, in the kitchen, in the bathroom, in the bedroom, in the lounge, where you might be sitting and you can pick it up and you can read the gospel again and again and again. And I think that's a great way to keep on practicing and stay focused. A fourth step is set up accountability systems. And by doing that, you're able to now measure how the gospel is being spread. You can measure how often you sharing it. What's the quality of the message you're sharing? And it allows you to improve that. It also shows to other people that it's actually happening. And also another good thing, if you remember, we spoke about is having a Great Commission offering. That's got nothing to do with money. When churches are able to gather, again, write on a piece of paper, how many people did you share the gospel with? How many people did you give gospel tracts to? And write down the number and then collect all the numbers and add it up. And what an amazing thing. You can say to your group, hey church, this week we shared the gospel with 200 people or 5 people or 50 people. It's a great way to encourage people to do evangelism. Step 5, if you have any leadership responsibility in your church, in your groups, then be the leader in evangelism. And so what I'm saying to you, I want to encourage you to model the upper levels of evangelism regularly. You know, it's one thing to teach about evangelism, but everybody who works with me, they know that they will always see me preaching the gospel. They will always see me giving gospel tracts, dropping gospel tracts. And so when you are actually doing evangelism, then you're moving away from just talking about it. And now people are seeing you doing it. And that has a profound effect on other believers. Lead by example. And the final point that we were looking at the end of 2020 was study. Study the Bible. And you can, by doing that, you can learn how to engage in the Great Commission. You can learn about the devil. You can learn about his strategies. And that is pretty much a summary of how we handled last year.